Okay, I believe we're live. By way of introduction, this is the second Police and Crime Commissioners Accountability Meeting, or PAM, since I was elected back in May. And as you'll all be aware, but some of the public might not be aware, this is the forum in which I carry out my statutory duty to hold Norfolk Constabulary to account and do so in public. Had been suggested during the last meeting that we would try and hold this in person. Unfortunately, the state of play with COVID is such that we've decided that we will have this as a virtual meeting. I'll keep that question under review meeting by meeting, but given the news today about where COVID is going and the possibilities over the winter, I sense that when we meet again in January, we probably once again will be virtual, but we'll make that call later on. And as before, we're being recorded, with that recording being streamed live, and will also be available on YouTube thereafter. So today's meeting. Let me cut immediately to the chase, and I'm speaking here very much as the public's elected representative. The public, and hopefully a number of them will be listening in, and certainly all of us here are extremely well aware that there have been issues recently that begs questions about the public's trust in police and policing. The horrible death of Sarah Everard has drawn attention not just to the despicable conduct of one police officer, but also to the fact that there are a small number, and I'll emphasise small number, of other officers who have not behaved, perhaps are not behaving to the high standard that the police demand and that also the public expects. The vast majority of officers are dedicated, they're hardworking, they're vocational people, and they definitely have the best interests of the public at heart. Nevertheless, sadly, they get lumped together with and inevitably are tarnished by the failings of that small minority. It's unfair, it's not supported by objective evidence. Nevertheless, the conduct of the minority can't be glossed over because the public's perception is that trust has been damaged, and that inevitably is a key theme of today's meeting. Rebuilding that trust, which is essential obviously to policing by consent, is going to take time, it's going to take work. And I'm aware that that work is already well in hand, and if members of the public haven't seen them, I draw attention to the Chief Constable's very clear statements on the subject in places like the EDP and on Radio Norfolk. And there's some good words being said there about what the Constabulary is doing to rebuild that trust. But I accept that more work will be needed, and this afternoon will be just one part of that work. So without further ado, let me move on to the agenda. Item 1, apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies on your side, Paul?
Yes, just apologies from Simon Medgix, who's got an essential appointment somewhere else, but between the rest of us, we'll be picking up Simon's areas of business.
Understood, thank you. And I believe we've got a full house, Mark.
Yes, we have. Yes.
So the OPCCN team is here. Item 2 then, declarations of personal and or prejudicial interest. I shall assume that there are no declarations that need to be made unless I see a hand go up in the next moment or two. No hands going up, that's encouraging. Let's move on then to item 3, minutes of the last meeting, which took place on the 29th of July. The minutes are included in the papers beginning at page 3. Are there any issues that anyone wants to raise from the floor, the virtual floor, about the minutes of the last meeting?
Giles, just from me, Malk Cook, I've put a quick paragraph amendment to Jordan around just part of the explanation on finance, but that'll all be handled when we update the minutes.
Okay, thank you for that. There was one issue raised by a member of the public, which was related to a question about economic crime, fraud and financial crime. It was asked at item 5 of the minutes on page 5. and I think I'll just turn to that. The person who asked that question has submitted another question on the basis that they were not content with the answer given. Now, my team has looked at both the original and the new question and the answer given last time, and we've considered, and I concur, that with one exception, the question was answered. The questioner does refer to more recent evidence, but we can't keep going back to the same question over and over again. So while I'm happy to answer the question with the individual, I don't propose to answer the whole thing again here. But the part of the question we didn't actually answer last time was the question of can you advise how many police officers are dedicated to investigating such crimes in Norfolk? I wonder, Paul, if you had a figure in mind. You probably need notice of that question, but
I'll ask Nick to address that one, if I may, Commissioner.
So, yeah, thank you,
Commissioner. The way in which the police service nationally, regionally and locally here in Norfolk is constructed to deal with fraud at present time sees Norfolk not having a small fraud team or a fraud team of officers that are absolutely purely dedicated to dealing with fraud. So I think that's the simple answer to that. However, the way in which it's structured does kind of require us to kind of understand how it works across the UK, really, to then get to why it's structured that way. I can probably do that in a couple of minutes if that's worth the investment of time.
I think it would be helpful, given the fact that this is a repeat question.
Okay, so look, broadly speaking, and these are generalities just for this public meeting. Commissioner, you'll be aware that obviously action fraud exists, and that was established by central government a number of years ago. And in essence, action fraud is the inbox for all sorts of fraud offences, of which there are a myriad of for the UK. And action fraud will act as an inbox, and they work then with the City of London police, who are the specialists in economic crime on behalf of UK policing. And the City of London, in essence, acts as a clearinghouse, and they will look at the frauds that have been reported to action fraud, working alongside action fraud, and a clearinghouse back to the local forces. So City of London will send us back action fraud reported crimes that sees offenders and victims that are Norfolk based, so Norfolk offenders and Norfolk victims. They will send us back investigations that relate to Norfolk based offenders, and they will give us the totality of all the victims that are known within the county of Norfolk, and Norfolk Constabulary will receive that. Before I then go on to explain how we work that through in Norfolk, there's in addition to the national effort that I've just described, there's regional efforts where the ROCUs in each of the region and URSU for us in the east, they will look at serious fraud, and they will take forward the investigations into serious fraud. And a number of years ago, all of the region's forces actually transferred officers and understanding and skills into URSU to give URSU what they needed to actually take forward serious fraud on our behalf as Norfolk Constabulary, Suffolk Constabulary, Cambridge Constabulary, etc. So again, there are serious frauds that occur within Norfolk that are the responsibility to investigate of the regional policing structure, as well as the opportunities for the national policing structure to do that as well in respect to Norfolk. So that then sees that's how fraud can be dealt with. Now, the ROCU, URSU, under the National Uplift Programme, are building their fraud capacity in terms of enforcement teams to kind of get upstream and get into early disruption opportunities, and Norfolk will see that benefit in respect to that work that URSU are undertaking currently. And then bringing that back to Norfolk, we have a joint cyber command between Norfolk and Suffolk Constabulary, which does have an investigative capacity across Norfolk and Suffolk to look particularly around cyber fraud. It also has cyber fraud prevention officers who work with businesses and individuals who are victims of fraud, cyber fraud in particular, and looks to work with those individuals and businesses to help them protect themselves. And again, that is part of the effort and energy that we've got within the constabulary to tackling fraud. And then in respect to those crimes that come back into Norfolk Constabulary from action fraud via the City of London. It then very much depends on what the nature of that crime and criminality is. So it may well be that it's linked to a vulnerable victim, adult victim, in which case the detectives and officers working within the Adult Abuse Investigation Unit will probably take primacy of that fraud investigation. If it's got a cyber aspect to it, then the cyber team may well take the particular lead on that investigation. A general fraud may well then go into the reactive CID teams that we've got across Norfolk. Or if it's a simple, straightforward fraud with easy investigation opportunities and low value, then it could be that the Safer Neighbourhood teams out in the County Policing Command will investigate it. So supporting those individual officers, we have a dedicated detective sergeant who will act as a fraud investigation expert and support in particular our uniformed colleagues mainly with writing up investigation plans to make sure that those frauds are properly and thoroughly investigated in line with detective skill sets. That's that is a dedicated post. But the way in which I've described how we eat fraud crime investigations, there is no one single team with a group of individual police officers completely and utterly dedicated to fraud within Norfolk, because of the way in which it's structured and has been dealt with over a number of years, both nationally, regionally, and in fact with our preferred partnership with Suffolk and then locally in Norfolk itself. We have made investments with our detectives in terms of upskilling them around fraud investigations. I have currently 10 to 12 detectives that we've given extra support and training to in terms of financial investigation and fraud investigation. So we have a core of individuals with expertise supporting the wider effort in terms of fraud investigation, and that's how we're currently structured. Now, we will always keep that under constant review, and as fraud changes in terms of government's position on it and UK policing's position on it, it may well be that we'll consider opportunities to structure it differently. But it's got to be seen in the context of a myriad of other crimes and criminal activities that we've got to deal with, whether it's rape and serious sexual offences, burglary dwellings, assaults, simple, straightforward thefts, and anything else. And that's probably the fullest answer I can give you at this moment in time, Commissioner.
No, that's very helpful, and I hope that answers the question raised. Thank you. I don't think there are any other issues arising from the minutes of the last meeting, unless any other hands go on. Nope. Let's move on to item 4, which is the COVID-19 update.
Commissioner, I'll cover this, and I will keep it brief. In your introduction, you alluded to the significant recent increase in infection rates across the country. That is very much reflected in Norfolk. Indeed, we are slightly above the average case rate per 100,000 for England, and pretty much equal with the East of England average, currently 424 cases per 100,000 people. By way of context, that's twice the level that we were at when we went into the December restrictions in 2020. Of course, in a different place now with vaccination, but nonetheless, significant challenge. Because there aren't any, because of where we are with restrictions at the moment, the main impact of that upon the constabulary is our internal sickness management. As of 2 days ago, we had 49 members of staff isolating across the constabulary, very well spread across our estate. It's our view that most of that is driven by infections that have been picked up by children of employees in school, it being 12 to 15-year-olds that are particularly seeing a local spike. So in addition to those isolation challenges, we have also got challenges in terms of those employees who have caring responsibilities. We are aware that the projections only see things increasing over the coming weeks. I'm also aware that the Health Secretary is due to make an announcement this evening, or at least hold a press conference this evening. So we'll wait to see what direction the Health Secretary takes. But across the constabulary, we will need to continue with our cautious position, which will remain very much under review over the weeks ahead.
Graham, thank you. I've got no further questions on that. That was very helpful. If we're content, I'll move on to item 5, questions from the public, which is going to be a fairly lengthy session. My office received 23 questions from the public, as you'd expect, covering a wide range of themes, specifically public trust in policing, violence against women and girls, rural crime, modern slavery, and speeding. There were 1 or 2 others as well. I would flag the fact that there are no questions arising from the terrible death of Sir David Amess on Friday, but I'm already aware from my postbag that there is a growing focus of public interest on online abuse, not just of MPs, but more generally. Cyberbullying of children is just one example. So I can see that being a subject that we deal with next time. But as I say, on this occasion, I have no questions. Coming back to today's questions, I've addressed 1 already under item 3. 1 more question has been taken out in general because it was in effect a freedom of information request, and it's been passed to the constabulary to answer, and my office has replied to the question to explain how that answer will be provided. I have drawn on some of those questions as part of my questioning, so it will come back to a degree, but in general terms that question will come out. I also took a 3rd question out last night when I was preparing for today. There's a very good question about the police precept of council tax, but I'd make the point that this forum is about holding the Chief Constable and the Constabulary to account. I'm responsible for the precept, so I'll answer the question in writing back to the questioner. But what I'll also do is forward that question to the Police and Crime Panel, who holds me to account, because they don't get very many questions from the public, and I think this is a question that rightly should be asked of me in a public forum. So that's how I'll tackle that one. I've taken the remaining 21. Some of them I've grouped together in themes, and I've also drawn on some of the correspondence my office has received in putting together the questions. Some of those questions I have moved to relevant items further down, so those to do with visible policing have gone into that item. So I won't go through all 21 under this item. As before, if for some reason we don't get through all the questions, we'll put written responses out on the website. Now, as I mentioned, the question of public trust in policing prompted the greatest number of questions, and I think we'll all agree it is the most important issue before us this afternoon. So let me begin with those questions and start by establishing the extent of the issue here in Norfolk. And this is where I do draw on some of the stuff that was really part of the freedom of information question. So, not sure what the best way. Shall I ask all the questions, Paul, and let you then come back and answer them, or would you like me to go through them 1 at a time? They're sort of basically asking for numbers.
If they're numbers, it might be best to do it 1 at a time, then, so we don't lose our thread.
Okay. I'll work through them. So the first one is, how many serving Norfolk police officers have convictions for sexual offences, sexual assault, sexual harassment, or sexual misconduct?
So the answer to that is none. It would probably help as well if I gave some additional information. In the last 5 years, 9 officers have received convictions, all of which are now not in the organisation, and they all left either because they were dismissed at misconduct hearings, or they resigned before their hearing. And if I can just touch on resignation before hearing, there is always an option for the Chief Constable to refuse someone's resignation to enable the hearing to take place. But in doing so, you continue to pay them using taxpayers' money whilst you wait for that hearing. So it's always a difficult decision for the Chief Constable. And of course, in all of these occasions, I was not the Chief Constable when the decision was being made, but decisions that I would nonetheless associate myself with, because individuals who resign still do go on a barred list, so they cannot be employed by any police force elsewhere in the country. And my position really has always been, as soon as we can stop them being paid by the taxpayer, I am always keen to do so. So the short answer is no officers with current convictions, and those that received convictions in the last 5 years, all 9 of them have left the organisation.
Very clear, thank you. A similar question, can you tell us how many serving officers have convictions for domestic violence offences involving assaults on women? And I assume this refers to male officers with offences with convictions for assaults on women. I would assume the same, and it remains that there are no officers with convictions in the constabulary. Good. And following on from that, are there any serving officers currently under investigation for sexual or domestic violence offences?
No.
And that neatly answers the next question that I was asked by a correspondent. If officers are still serving, what has the Chief Constable done to satisfy himself that the public are safe from these particular officers? And you've already explained that they do not remain in the force. Therefore, the public are safe from those officers.
Yes, I mean, the only thing I'd add to that, Commissioner, is in the event of an allegation being received about an officer, it is the role of the Deputy Chief Constable to determine whether that officer would be suspended whilst an investigation is taking place, because it is the case that that officers have been subject to allegations before in the past, and for a variety of reasons those allegations have either been disproven or there's not been sufficient evidence to prove the allegation. So in the circumstances where such an allegation is made, the Deputy Chief Constable will consider whether suspension is necessary. There are a number of tests that the Deputy makes when coming to that decision, one of the most important ones being the public interest. And we are very alive to the public interest concerning all forms of violence against women and girls at the moment. And I have no doubt that that would be at the forefront of Simon Medgick's, the current DCC's, mind, should he find himself in the position where he has to make suspension decisions in the weeks and months ahead.
And following on from that, there was a report in the media after the conviction of Wayne Couzens that a Norfolk officer had been involved in a WhatsApp group. May I assume that that officer is currently suspended?
That officer is currently suspended. The investigation is being independently managed by the IOPC. It's important for me to say that at this stage that is an allegation and no more. It has received significant media attention for reasons which are quite appropriate, but at this stage it is an allegation and no more, and we await the outcome of the IOPC's investigation.
You broke up slightly in that. I don't know if that was just me or others, but could you just say the last piece again?
I believe it might be your line, Commissioner, but the...
Okay. Can I just sorry to interrupt, can I just confirm, Jordan, that you got the answer for the tape?
Yes, I received the answer. That's clear on my end.
Yeah, at our end, Commissioner, your camera's gone particularly fuzzy, so I don't know if there's a problem with your line.
It could well be my line. Yeah. Okay. So I'll assume that the public, heard that answer, so that's fine. Thank you. Which leads me on to the last of my block of questions on this. Can you tell us what training and subsequent guidance is given to officers about reporting misconduct by fellow officers? And have any officers been investigated for failing to report misconduct of fellow officers?
Yes, so officers receive training at various points throughout their career within the constabulary on these topics. So student officers receive an input on the second day of their careers with the constabulary, which covers all aspects of values, standards, and conduct, and included within there are details as to how allegations can be reported, including through our anonymous reporting line, which was set up following a recommendation from what was then the IPCC's report in 2012. We also repeat those inputs at various stages and at gateways to different posts within the constabulary. So, for example, newly appointed custody sergeants receive an input on their custody course. Civilian detention officers receive the same on their custody course. We are in the process of working our way through a number of presentations to all of our sergeants on these topics. We have recently completed training for our police digital investigators, and more generally, if not so much formal training, the constabulary is in the process of rolling out a number of communications with regards to conduct, value, and standards, and that will be a thematic which will be pushed around throughout the constabulary over the next few months. In terms of reporting, during annual PDR health checks, there is an expectation that supervisors speak regularly with staff in a one-to-one setting, so that there's an opportunity for concerns to be raised. I believe you asked how many officers are being investigated for failing to report such matters. In the last 5 years, there has been only 2 such investigations. One relates to the ongoing IOPC matter that we spoke about a few moments ago, so I will say no more on that. One relates to an investigation in 2016, which was investigated by the then IPCC. So it was an independent investigation by IPCC, and they determined that there was no case to answer. It was their investigation, not a constabulary one.
Grant, thank you. I'm now going to pick up on 3 questions which the public have sent in, and I'll ask all 3 together. Can you reassure us that the highest standards are being applied and applied consistently to the recruitment, vetting and re-vetting of officers? The second one is, are officers patrolling alone or are they deploying in pairs? I assume that's a question about supervision of individual officers. And the third one is, how can women trust that Norfolk Constabulary is taking the urgent practical steps needed to win the trust of women? I just observe on those 3 questions that they all seem to suggest that police officers are male. So perhaps in answering, could I ask you to reflect on the numbers of female officers that are in the force?
Yes, I will do. So if I start with entry into the service, I've seen the significant public commentary around vetting and entry into policing, and in many respects, I think some of that commentary has perhaps overstated the role that vetting can have. Vetting is vitally important, and every new recruit, whether that be police officer or staff, undergoes full vetting checks before they join us. There are currently delays in our vetting procedures because we do not compromise on the checks that we need to do before anyone joins us. I can report that in the last 2 years, we have refused the applications of over 130 police officer applicants through vetting checks. Now that tells me that we have a strong and robust regime in place. Of course, what vetting cannot do is predict what someone is going to do in the future. And it's in that regard where I believe that it can give you a false level of confidence. So the constabulary needs to ensure that it has other measures in place to ensure that we continue to scrutinise the behaviour of officers and staff. It is the case that we regularly re-vet staff throughout their time in the constabulary, particularly when they move into new posts, but there are periodic checks throughout someone's lifetime in the constabulary. And it's also important to say that those checks do include a level of social media research, but social media is such a vast entity that we would never have the resource to check every single message sent or platform that a member of staff that a staff member signs up to. It would be impossible to do so, and therefore we do have to carry out proportionate searches, but searches we do. I mentioned that other measures need to be in place to complement vetting. We have an anti-corruption unit, which the staffing of which I increased last year, in March this year. That anti-corruption unit proactively investigates all forms of misconduct behaviour, and I include use of position for sexual purpose within that behaviour, and indeed any form of misconduct related to violence against women and girls. So our anti-corruption unit is present and monitors behaviours of officers. And as alluded to beforehand, earlier, we have confidential reporting lines through which our staff can anonymously report any concerns that they may well have. And finally, on this area, over the last 3 or 4 years, the constabulary has developed a very strong women's network, internal women's network called the Forum, which is very prominent throughout the constabulary, and another means through which anyone who does have the concerns about the behaviours of a colleague can report them in a less formal way to I guess what I'd call a listening ear. It isn't necessarily your supervisor or someone in a position of rank. So I hope that answers the first question in terms of the measures that we have in place. I believe the second one related to patrol.
Training and pairs, yeah.
Yeah. It is the case that we deploy our officers both in pairs, but also single crewed and on their own. And we simply do not have the resources available to us for us to double crew officers all of the time. And actually, it would be quite inefficient for us to do so, where quite often an officer just needs to work their way through their own inquiries, whether that be picking up some CCTV, doing some house-to-house inquiries. It would be inefficient if we were to do that in in pairs. Overnight from 2300 hours, sometimes earlier, all of our officers do revert to being double crewed. And out of those times, we take a risk-based approach. I suspect that the focus of this question concerns the fact that Wayne Couzens was single crewed, and it was the fact that he was that he was on his own rather than single crewed. Sorry, Couzens was on his own, and it was the fact that he was on his own that allowed him to commit his awful offence. Couzens, of course, was off duty, but we are very alive to the fact that that residents may feel concerned in light of what's happened with Couzens should they be approached by a single officer. We have provided guidance to all of our officers, making it clear to them that should they encounter anyone who is concerned about the reasons for their encounter, that it is the responsibility of the police officer concerned to prove the legitimacy of what they're doing. It is not for the person who they stop on the street, and we've provided our officers with a number of practical ways in which they could do that, which could include calling another colleague to the scene. It could include agreeing to meet the person concerned at a police station at a later date, or it could also include putting their personal radio on speaker mode so that the individual in front of them can communicate with the control room as a means of confirming the reasons why they are there. And then finally, Commissioner, I wonder if you could just come back to the third question for me. I believe it was on trust, but if you could just repeat the detail of it, I would be grateful.
Yes, it was how can women trust that Norfolk Constabulary is taking the urgent practical steps needed to win the trust of women? And then the supplementary, which I added, was how many female officers are there in the force?
Yes. I refer back really to the comments that I've made in the external media over the last 2 weeks on this topic. Everyone in the constabulary recognises that the events of the last few weeks have caused immeasurable damage to the trust and confidence that communities, and particularly women, have in the service. And we know that that trust will not be rebuilt overnight. I think the best response that policing in Norfolk can give is to continue to provide the best possible service to victims, to offer support and compassion to those who call upon us in crisis, and continue to promote and highlight the excellent work which we do. Because the real shame, or one of many shames really, but the real shame of the last few weeks is that it's put the excellent work that we do in the shadows somewhat. Now, internally, I have spoken to over 290 of our supervisors over the last 2 weeks, setting absolutely clear the standards and values of the organisation. I followed that up with briefings to our senior managers and made clear, and I would have expected it to be there anyway, but made clear that the scrutiny upon us at the moment is as high as it's ever been, and that leadership and good policing is the solution to this challenge. We practically we have launched we have signed up to a national initiative called Street Safe. That's a scheme that has been launched by the Home Office and is a mechanism whereby anyone in the county can anonymously report to us areas where they do not feel safe. So far, we've had approaching 300 responses to that launch, and we are now in the process of collating that information, and we will be carrying out patrols in the hotspot areas identified by our residents as areas where they do not feel safe. I'm encouraged by that, and I will continue to promote the scheme over the weeks ahead. We will also be ensuring that we complete all of the actions set out in the recently drafted National Police Chiefs Council Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. That includes a number of commitments for the force, which I think will lead to us improving our service. Nick Davison is been appointed as the senior responsible officer for that programme of work. And then more generally, we know that the overwhelming majority of violence against women and girls occurs in the home and is perpetrated through domestic abuse. And you'll know, Commissioner, that domestic abuse has been a priority of the force for some time. And I am sure that it will be a priority which will be reflected in your police and crime plan once that has been formalised. We will continue to prioritise domestic abuse because we recognise the harm that it causes across the county. And we are particularly committed to putting our focus on the perpetrators of domestic abuse and really putting the focus on them to complement the work which we do to support victims.
Thank you.
Numbers, sorry, I will come to.
Yes. Oh yes, even I was forgetting that for a moment.
If I may, whilst we come to the next questions, I will look up the current overall number for female officers. It was only sent to me yesterday and I want to get it right. But in the last year, we have been recruiting 40% female officers, police officers, and that number is increasing all of the time. Obviously, we aspire to get it up to 50%. I'll check what our overall establishment figure is whilst we're talking, Commissioner, and I will share that in a moment. Important to say that police staff-wise, we employ more females than we do males. So net total, we equal out broadly 50-50. But I will provide those figures any moment now.
No, brilliant, thank you. I think that's all the questions I got specifically on that point. I'm hugely grateful to you for all those answers because, and indeed your frankness in answering them in the way you have. I think that sets out a context that the public otherwise wouldn't be aware of, and I would ask the public to consider what you've told us. Yes, there's work to be done to restore trust, but we, and when I say we, I mean neither the public nor the police, we must not allow the damage that Wayne Couzens has done to public trust to be his lasting legacy to policing. So we have rightly focused on the public's concern about trust, but I would ask the public, having heard those answers, to really consider them carefully and join with the debate so that we can restore trust as quickly as possible. Because meanwhile, as the Chief Constable alluded to, there is a lot of very good work continuing, even though we're discussing the trustworthiness of police officers. Those same police officers are cracking on with their job. And I think it's really important to end this part of the questioning on that point.
And Commissioner, I have the figures in front of me now. If
please
share them just for the record. So for police staff, we employ 775 female and 495 male.
Mm-hmm.
And for police officers, we employ 1,196 male and 557 female. But to reiterate the point, our most recent intakes have seen 40% female. It will obviously take some time to turn the overall number, but we're heading in the right direction. Obviously, I would like 50%, and that's what we hope to work towards.
Grant, thank you. Let me move on now to the, I call it the wider question of violence against women and girls. how many cases of violence against women and girls have there been in the last 12 months? How many have been prosecuted? How many have not? And can you explain why not? And then as a supplementary, how many convictions have there been? Now, I recognise that we're beginning to move in the end of that question from policing into what might be the Crown prosecution and the courts arena, but if you can help us with any of that, that would be very useful.
Yes, if you could just give me one moment as I try and find my figures.
We can always post an answer online if I've sort of ambushed you without the data to hand.
I would be grateful if we could, please.
Yeah, let's do that.
Please,
No, I'm conscious that without knowing the questions coming, it's a little difficult to be prepared on every single last detail. So yeah, point taken. But if we could publish the answer, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
I'll go on to the next question then, and you've touched on the recommendations from the recent report on violence against women and girls and their implementation. But in that context, I'd like to draw on one of the questions from the public, and the questioner asks about, and again, I have to say this may be a question about public trust, because I quote, "The systematic, entrenched and culture of victim blaming, misogynistic attitudes and damaging behaviour." The questioning continues to say that the service has so often repeatedly failed in its duty to protect and support victims and survivors adequately. Now, I'm mindful that that looks as though it's a question about the whole criminal justice system. So perhaps could I ask you to clarify what parts of the service is the responsibility of constabulary?
Yes, happy to do so. I mean, if I can just take the sort of broader sentiment within the question first of all as well, please, Commissioner. I do repeat what I said earlier about the awful circumstances of Sarah Everard's death. Clearly demonstrate where policing has got some significant improvements to make. And none of that is lost on me. And I've said publicly in the last few weeks that we recognise that and we have an absolute commitment to do what we can to improve matters. But equally, I repeat my message that the vast majority of people come to work for Norfolk Constabulary because they want to make their communities better. And they have an absolute determination to make women, girls and all parts of our communities as safe as they possibly can. And that is a difficult task because we have a significant problem with domestic abuse in this country at the moment, to an extent that I would say makes it almost a public health challenge given the extent of it. And we know that only 1 in 28, 1 in 30 cases are ever reported to us in the first place. And even then, domestic abuse accounts for over 20% of the crime that we record now. Indeed, I do not think that there's a crime that the constabulary dedicates more resource to. Of course, none of that helps a victim of domestic abuse, and I recognise that. But I think it's important to set the context, and I think it's also important to understand the causes behind that abuse. And I think one of the biggest causes is that, frankly, too many people in society do not know what a healthy and normal relationship looks like. and therefore interventions that improve education and particularly around relationships, and particularly in schools, I think are just vital in this context. So when it comes to all forms of violence against women and girls, of course, it's the constabulary's job to, with all of our best energy and effort, provide the evidence that is available so that the Crown Prosecution Service can determine whether there is a realistic prospect of a prosecution so that a case can be heard in court. And that is quite often a high bar. And the bar that ultimately we need to convict is beyond reasonable doubt. And quite often these cases are difficult because they concern an interaction between two people, which can sometimes brew down to one person's word against another. Nonetheless, in all of those encounters, the expectation of me on our officers is that our officers do their utmost to present the evidence that they're to the best of their ability.
Thank you. And I think just by way of comment, I think that the purpose of the government's violence against women and girls strategy is to address a number of the issues that perhaps has led to the perception that this questioner has brought forward. So we're moving in the right direction, I believe.
Yes.
You touched on domestic abuse, and the next question is about domestic abuse, and actually repeats some of the comments you've already made. Domestic abuse is grossly underreported, with an average of 30 incidents occurring before a complaint is made to the police, and the figures are higher in the BAME communities. What priorities is given to these crimes, and what training is given to officers to correctly identify behaviours and perpetrators and correctly process the investigation to increase the likelihood of prosecutions? In many respects, you've already answered the first part in another context, but perhaps you could give us a view on the second part.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So to reiterate, fully supportive of the needs to prioritise violence against women and girls, and we will be committing to the strategy which you refer to. The response to both rape and domestic abuse is governed through dedicated delivery boards with oversight at chief officer level within the constabulary. I receive updates on both our monthly command team meetings and our performance, whether that be arrest rates, solve rates, outcome rates, is further overseen by the Deputy Chief Constable through their performance board. I think evidence of our commitment to prioritising rape, serious sexual offences and domestic abuse is the construction of the 2 new police stations at Swaffham and Broadland Hub, which are primarily investigation hubs, whereby we can pull together our investigative resources to ensure that we investigate those cases to the best of our ability. Those hubs will enhance our capacity to carry out digital investigations, which are so commonly an aspect of rape, serious sexual offences and domestic abuse cases currently, and will be supported by the recent recruitment of several police digital investigators who again enhance our capability to investigate these forms of crimes. And indeed, you'll also be aware that at those sites there will be facilities to ensure that we have a more personal service for victims, so that they can make disclosures to us in the most appropriate way. You will know that we are working closely with your office around the domestic abuse perpetrator scheme, and indeed for a number of initiatives relating to domestic abuse. We, in terms of training, It is training on domestic abuse is is standard throughout a student officer's training period, and again, students are assessed in their ability to investigate such crimes throughout the subsequent portfolio of evidence that they need to produce before they're signed off as a competent officer. And we repeat training periodically for frontline staff when required. Currently in Norwich, we are piloting a domestic abuse car, so that we have an officer with a higher level of skills who is on duty on late shifts where the bulk of domestic abuse cases occur, and in the parts of the city where we see the highest level of domestic abuse calls. So we have made an investment there. We are seeking to improve our already strong relationship with CPS so that we can increase the number of cases taken to court for violence against women and girls offences. It is fair to say that the pandemic has caused us some challenges with the amount of time it is taking to get the most serious cases to court because of the closure of some of the court estate, but we are now making progress on that. And as well as taking more cases to court, we're also working to build our capacity for out-of-court disposals for less serious cases, because actually we recognise that some of the interventions that we can put in place through out-of-court solutions may deal more appropriately with the root cause of the issue and therefore address further offending. So overall, we hope that we have in place a schedule of activity that's governed at the strategic level, but ultimately will see victims receiving a more victim-focused service and more suspects seeing justice. And that is absolutely the determination we have across the constabulary.
Thank you. We were talking about domestic abuse there, but I'm mindful the same question about priority and resources could also be asked across a range of other activities, mental health, modern day slavery, exploitation of vulnerable adults and children. We're asking a huge amount of police officers, particularly in terms of some of this specialised training. I just wonder if we're asking too much. I'm thinking of that newly graduated officer, fresh out of basic training at Heatherset, who is the first responder on a Saturday night to an incident. Are we able to give them sufficient basic training across the whole spectrum of issues they might face?
Commissioner, I think it's a very good question, and it's a real challenge. If I was just to reflect on the last 2 or 3 months with the challenges that policing has faced, we've seen firearms and firearms licensing with the tragic shooting in Plymouth, violence against women and girls, so rape, domestic abuse and violence on the streets. And then most recently, the social media concerns, which you alluded to following the tragic death last Friday. And we ask more and more of our officers. The new entry routes into policing, which commence in April, are in part one solution to that. So it will see an extension of student officer training so that the curriculum is enlarged, so that there's more time to learn about the complexities of policing. But actually, I think we need to be realistic as to what one individual can absorb. Indeed, I was speaking to the Chief Executive of the College Policing on this very topic last week, and he recognises that the college have got a role to play here in perhaps providing some technology that can be used, effectively a product in a pocket, which an officer can use to look up best practice whilst they're out on the streets to help them ensure that they make the right informed decisions. But it's a challenge, and of course the other issue is our abstraction rate as a consequence of the increased training that we are going to be giving to police officers is growing all of the time. So in our response teams, we already work on an abstraction rate of 43%. And I think practically that will tip over to over 50% very soon. And therefore we find ourselves in a really difficult position whereby the additional professionalisation which our officers clearly need to enable them to meet the challenges of policing in the modern age hits visibility and the ability for us to be able to answer calls. And at some point, something has got to give, because there's a limit to how many priorities our officers can take on. There's a limit to how much training that they can absorb. I'm very alive to that, and I suspect it will be a conversation that the force has with you regularly over the years ahead.
Yeah, I was struck by the IOPC's impact statement, which referred very proudly and probably very rightly to the fact that 400 pieces of learning have been passed to constabularies. And I was wondering behind the scenes as I asked that question about if they've produced 400, if the inspectorate have produced recommendations, College of Policing, APCC, MPCC, then there's government guidance, legislation and so on. How do we take all of that and bundle it in a manner that a 20-year-old constable fresh from training can assimilate and apply? It's a very interesting discussion. And yes, I think we need to do some work on that. I probably need to write to the policing minister and flag this up the system as a real issue. I'm really struck by the fact you're talking about 50% of officers being abstracted, because as you correctly identify, that erodes both visible policing and the ability to tackle crime, both sides of what I've previously described as the expectation gap. And of course, then full circle goes back to public trust, because when they ask for a police officer, there's not one available because they're doing training.
Indeed, and when that happens, the main area for abstractions is neighbourhood policing. Make no bones about it, because we have to attend response calls. We have no option but to do that. So the abstraction comes from the neighbourhood policing, which I know was flagged to you when you were campaigning for your current role as one of the things that is most important to residents of Norfolk. And so you mentioned the IOPC. In the context of violence against women and girls, we already know that there will be an IOPC report into Wayne Couzens, which undoubtedly will have learning included within it. There's an HMIC thematic inspection on its way, covering vetting standards and violence against women and girls, which is hot on the heels of the recent HMI's inspection into domestic abuse. We know that the Metropolitan Police have commissioned their own internal review led by Dame Louise Casey. And we know that the Home Secretary has announced a non-statutory inquiry also into violence against women and girls. And we also have the National Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. Now, the constabulary will absolutely do its best to learn the lessons from all of those publications. But you touch upon an important factor here in terms of the clarity for our officers on the front line as to what's expected. That's very challenging, and very challenging to get that to brew down in such a way whereby it actually makes a difference to officers on the front line. What we will seek to do locally through Nick's role is to suck up all of those reference materials and produce one Norfolk focused message so that we do try to provide that clarity. But Commissioner, it is a challenge.
Yeah, understood. I think we should move on, otherwise we shall still be here at breakfast time tomorrow morning. I'll move on to rural crime, and a couple of questions, two questions here. The first about hare coursing, what more can be done to address hare coursing and illegal fox hunting? And the questioner asks, should we just dial 999? Would this qualify as an emergency call when they witness such activity?
Okay, so hare, the contact and control room will prioritise calls based upon the nature of it. I always find it hard to answer questions such as this, Commissioner, because it really does depend on the circumstances. Yeah, if there's a crime in progress, then typically it's the right thing to do is to call 999. The control room will then determine what the best resources are to send to that incident. I should say that the constabulary has been very successful in recent years in dealing with hare coursing. We've had a number of successful prosecutions, seized a significant number of dogs and vehicles from those who perpetrate these offences. We know the damage they cause to the rural communities, and we've worked very hard with neighbouring forces, particularly Lincolnshire, Cambs and Suffolk, very hard to make some real improvements, and we have made some real gains compared to other areas in the country. The level of hare coursing in Norfolk is considerably lower, but we will continue to put resource towards those issues. In terms of hunts, such matters are occasionally reported to constabulary. It's natural that as a rural county, we've many established hunt groups which are lawfully entitled to hunt using scent. It is not the place of the constabulary to stand in the way of lawful activity. We do also receive reports of hunt monitoring groups undertaking reported unlawful action to disrupt lawful events. And when that occurs, we will deploy and to the best of our ability resolve the issues. It's fair to say that this subject evokes strong feeling from both sides. We try to resolve these matters through engagement, through conversation and through compromise, but that's not always easy. But we stand ready to respond when needed to do so.
And the second question under rural crime is about the theft of agricultural equipment, but particularly the use of containers to export it out of the country to Europe and beyond. Is there anything else we are able to do to inspect containers before they're sealed and leave our shores? I don't know the process for which a container is delivered to a container port, dealt with by customs, and that before it's loaded onto a container ship and disappears over the horizon.
Yes, I mean, I understand why the question would be asked. I mean, the sheer volume of containers that leave our ports, particularly Felixstowe, is just colossal. And with the challenges at those locations at the moment associated with supply chain, Brexit, HGV drivers, you name it, that's probably a difficult area for us to be operating in. We do, if I start with some positives, we have nationally seen a reduction in plant theft over the last 12 months. We have locally run a number of operations targeting those that seek to commit crime against the agricultural communities, and we're working hard with partners such as Navis, the NFU and fuel suppliers to tackle this sort of criminality. I think police resource would be most effectively used if it's intelligence led and if we are targeting the offenders who we believe to be perpetrating this crime. And I think we'll get better dividend than doing that than we would perhaps the checks at the docks. Our moonshot teams are day in, day out almost stopping individuals involved in this sort of criminality and having a really good impact in limiting it, and they will continue to do so.
Great. I'm just conscious of the time, so I shall keep moving along. Turning to modern day slavery, two questions, and I'll give you both at once. The first questioner says that Cambridgeshire has a dedicated unit tasked to tackle exploitation of modern slavery. Do we have a similar problem in Norfolk, and is there any intent to create a similar unit? And second, what measures does Norfolk have in place to deal with modern day slavery?
So Norfolk Constabulary has our MAST team. Stands for Missing, Adult Sex Work, Slavery and Trafficking team. So they are established to deal with these very issues. I believe it was set up in 2017. We also have a network of modern day slavery champions, typically uniformed police officers who've just got that enhanced level of training, that operate across the county. And we have strong relationships with Children's Services and the Salvation Army, who work together with us in partnership to tackle this form of criminality. So we do put significant resource into these areas, and it is an issue in Norfolk as much as it is everywhere else within the country.
Graham, thank you. The next question is about police dogs. Do you have plans to equip dogs with stab vests and goggles?
The short answer is no, but we, Commissioner, we do take the safety of our dogs very seriously. And I know that some forces are starting to explore body armour. I think there's an equal concern that armour can cause problems with heat, can cause problem with joints and bones, that probably just needs to be explored before we decide whether that's the right thing for our dogs. What we're also doing is looking at how we can use other technologies to limit the dangerous circumstances where we do put dogs. So, for example, through our drones team now, we now have the capability to deploy small indoor drones into houses where we may be responding to a firearms incident, where previously we would have simply put the dog through the door and let them tackle what was in front of them. So, body armour always under review, but need to be careful that it doesn't solve one problem and then create another one for the dog.
Yeah. Moving on, a couple of questions about ex-military veterans. How do we identify ex-military veterans, and what special measures or pathways exist for them? And the question is asking both questions in the context of all stages of the criminal justice system, but I'm mindful that you would probably only wish to answer this in a police context.
Yes, so
from the perspective of the PIC.
Yes, so whenever a detainee gets booked into custody anywhere in Norfolk or indeed Suffolk, they are asked if they have ever served in Her Majesty's forces, regular or reserve. Should the answer to that question be yes, then they are asked if they consent to being referred to Project Nova, and Project Nova then swings into gear, which is well, you'll be familiar with the scheme. We have had a total of 47 veterans who have been asked the question as to whether they're a former member, and 38% agreed to be referred to Project Nova. Earlier on, I alluded to our work on out-of-court disposals. That team are aware of Project Nova and are also looking to refer individuals to them who may well otherwise be looking at a criminal justice sanction. Hopefully that addresses the question, Commissioner.
No, I think it does. Thank you. Let me move on then to speeding, noting as I do so that, I fully understand there are perhaps what might be perceived to be more serious issues on the agenda. This is actually the issue that gets raised the most with me as I go around the county, and I sense likewise with your neighbourhood officers. I'm not going to ask you to look at issues at specific locations. Some of the questions have come in asking about specific points, but I think that's something we can pass to neighbourhood teams to look at. But I did get two questions about the enforcement of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. Just looking at what I've got. Yes, so it was the issue of how we enforce, whether we enforce 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. And I think am I right in thinking there is a difference between a 20-mile-an-hour speed zone, which is not actually a limit, and a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit?
I'm going to give everyone a break from my voice and ask Eamon to address all matters speeding. So, Eamon, do you mind stepping in for this one?
Thanks, Chief, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'll make some general comments around speeding, and then hopefully try and deal with the 20-mile-an-hour issue at the end, if I may. So we absolutely recognise that the community have speeding as a very high priority. We hear that in all of our engagement work. We continue to prioritise speeding as part of the Fatal 4 enforcement that we undertake as a constabulary. We look to be data-led wherever possible to deploy finite resource around speeding issues, and particularly focusing on the highest risk sites wherever we can. We are fortunate as a county to have a highly effective safety camera partnership that now has just over 600 enforcement locations that are regularly visited and 27 fixed site cameras that are used. We also have an ever-growing community speed watch scheme, which we're keen to support wherever possible. Our own safety camera team will respond to all complaints around speeding and look to conduct further assessment work to then categorise where it's appropriate different sites based on their risk, and where identified as high risk, we would look to deploy enforcement activities on a fortnightly basis to those locations. We use the data that's built through a range of survey methods to inform how we then deploy both on a camera basis and through policing resource. And that's not just specialist roads and policing roads and armed policing teams, but also local police resources. We have significant impact as a result, and we've produced a number of different reports that show the level of enforcement activity over recent months and years, which we can make available. We seek to continuously review those deployments and react where there are further issues highlighted by the communities. And importantly, for those that have those specific issues, the routes in are directly to the engagement officers in the Safer Neighbourhood teams, or indeed to the safety camera team, as I've said. That will instigate that assessment work and then operational deployment beyond. The 20-mile-an-hour zone or limit is a slightly different conundrum. You're right, there is a difference between the two. There's very much an onus around the 20-mile-an-hour identified sites because of their significance and concerns, often around schools or other highly populated places, that actually engineering should be the predominant approach to resolving the issues that exist in those locations. So that's not just down to policing, it's very much a partnership approach, and highways having a sort of prominent lead role around those engineering options. Appreciate that there may be a perception that we wouldn't enforce in those areas, and there has been guidance that we look to work towards that means it might be less obvious or less frequent that we enforce, but however it doesn't exclude us from doing it where there are persistent offences or indeed additional safety issues. So again, the same routes of complaints around those speeding issues in a 20-mile-an-hour zone or indeed restriction, we would look to have that contact from the community wherever possible. We would conduct the same safety assessments and then potentially look to deploy our resources based on the outcome of the risk assessment for those locations too. So it's not a no, we wouldn't enforce around 20 mile an hour. However, we need to look at a broader range of options that would look to self-regulate those locations in conjunction with partners. Hopefully that's dealt with both elements, but if there was anything else required, please. Happy to try and expand.
That sounds grand. And I think that's also embraced the next question, which I had on my list, which was about speeding in rural areas, rural villages. I think in your introduction, you've really swept up the answer to that one. There is a question from a member of a community speedwatch group. I think I will leave that for the moment, and perhaps you can answer that in-house, because there's probably a sort of internal policy issue there thinking about it. So let me move swiftly on to the question about cyclists on pavements. And the question of comments on the belief of cyclists that they both have a right to use the pavement and have a right of way on the pavement. Is there anything we can do about that, or is that sadly a problem of reality?
Yes, I'm cautious, Commissioner, because I know the cyclists versus other road users is quite a debate sometimes. I think it's the constabulary has the option to take action against any cyclists who cycle on pavements or cause danger to others in the way that they use their bike. Periodically, road policing colleagues have done campaigns in and around cycling safety as well. I think it's also important to note that particularly in Norwich, but not exclusively, some of our decisions have been made whereby some of our pedestrianised areas have been made available and accessible to cyclists. So what might appear as a pavement is actually an area where they are legally entitled to be. And particularly in Norwich, I know that sometimes can cause issues. But I other than to say that we will take action when it's appropriate to do so, I'm not sure what else I can say to the question.
Okay, no, understood. Thank you. I'll take one more question from the public under this item. There's a few more coming under visible policing, but it's the one about parking. Again, an issue raised wherever I go. Why do the police not do more to tackle motorists who park in such a manner that blocks the highway? And the questioner notes that in some areas there are no parking restrictions, and so the district council don't have the powers to enforce. I sense this is, I mean, my understanding is that this is largely an issue that has been passed to the county council and by the county council to their contractor. So I think that would be the first point that I would make, that parking is not in the first instance a constabulary responsibility, but when would the constabulary engage? And the question did, for example, make reference to obstruction of emergency vehicles.
Nick, by all means.
His hand's gone up, fair enough.
So, Chief, I wondered if so, to Commissioner, so a number of years ago, I led on the work in the county to decriminalise parking offences, and we transferred that under the relevant legislation from a police enforcement action to a local government enforcement action, and that was transferred to Norfolk County Council with an arrangement with the district councils as well in terms of how it was structured in the county of Norfolk. So I think that is the first thing to say, is that double yellow lines, single yellow lines, etc., are no longer. In fact, we do not have the lawful authority within the legislation framework to deal with those issues. What clearly the police have retained is the ability to deal with dangerous obstructions. So where there is a dangerous obstruction, so particularly around junctions, where the vehicle parked is obscuring the line of sight of the junction and makes it dangerous, then police has retained the ability to either ticket that vehicle, or if necessary, because the obstruction is so dangerous, physically remove that car. Now, we rely, don't we, on members of the public to tell us about such circumstances, and I would say that that's the routes that we would normally have. So speak with your neighbourhood policing team locally. If you've got a perennial problem, they've got obviously their email inboxes. You can dial 101 and deal with it that way as well. In terms of contacting, we've got snap meetings where we go to the public and obviously set the priorities for the local policing teams too. I think the main issues that we see here and the main tension is clearly around schools, and it was of note in the EDP and other papers locally in the last few days that that is still very much a fact and alive. And again, the first port of call is with the school, then into the local authority partnership in respect of their parking enforcement officers. But we do find ourselves still brought into those circumstances, particularly where obviously there's the potential for public order offences because parents are getting frayed in terms of their behaviours and frustrations. But it is a challenging issue. But the police's role within it is very narrow and very specific around policing matters of public order, public safety, and not the general issues around enforcing parking.
Thank you. I think that completes item 5, and we've been going for about an hour and a half. Are we content to keep going, or does anyone need a 5-minute break? No hands going up, voting for 5-minute break. Paul, are you content to keep going, or would you prefer a 5-minute break?
I'm happy to keep going, but I wonder if I could just clarify one point from right at the start of that session, if I may.
Yeah, of course.
I think it was your very first question, actually. You asked how many officers have been charged with a criminal offence, and my answer was 9. I just wanted to make clear that was for a wide variety of offences and not just sexual offences. So that included things such as driving with excess alcohol, fraud, etc. So I just wouldn't have wanted to give the impression that was 9 sexual offences. It was a wide variety of offences.
No, that's very helpful, because actually the question was about sexual offences, so the clarity is important in the current context. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Grand. Let's move on then. Item 6, good stewardship of taxpayers' money. And for the benefit of the public, we're now moving on to those areas of the police and crime plan that we routinely bring forward to these meetings. And I think there are 7 priorities in the current plan. And we bring forward 2 or 3 at each meeting and take reports on them. So this report is in the papers, starting at page 11. Do we want to say anything about the report, or Peter, do you want to say anything about this?
I can introduce 2 of those papers that are part of that good stewardship element, Commissioner, if that's okay.
Please.
The first one is on finance, and then there's one on estates as well that I'll cover off. So the budget monitoring paper is based on information to the end of period 4, and it's forecasting through to the end of the year. As a whole, the group is forecasting an underspend of 185,000, which is 0.1% of the net revenue budget, so a very modest element of the net revenue budget. Out of that 185,000, 125,000 of the underspend is attributed to the constabulary. And in the main, this is due to underspends from transport and some overachievement of income as well. This is offsetting a planned overspend on pay through a surge on officer recruitment in order to meet not just the uplift target that nationally we've been asked to achieve, which for this year was 66 officers, but also to maintain our frontline officer numbers ahead of moving into the police education qualification framework arrangements and the police constable degree apprenticeship, which, as the Chief was alluding to earlier, is going to increase the amount of abstraction on the front line. So we're doing this planned surge in officer recruitment, and that's noted in the report. It's also worthy of note that we planned, as part of the budget setting process last year, we planned to make £4 million of savings this year, and we have removed the budgets from the respective budget lines, and we are on track to achieve those savings. And then finally on the finance paper, just in terms of the capital programme, we're forecasting to slip £2 million of that programme into the next financial year, and that's in respect of the scheme that we have at Broadland Gate and the development and build of the new police station there. Because now we've got the contractors on site, we understand how the costs are going to fall across the 2 financial years. So that briefly covers off the finance paper. I'll touch on the estates paper and then open up to questions at that point. But the paper on estates just gives a high-level overview of the activity across the Norfolk estate in terms of the constabulary activity around our premises. I've referred to Broadland Gate in terms of the financial paper, but it's also a highlight within the estates paper as well. Work is now well underway at Broadland in terms of the build of the new police station there, and we're looking for that to be fully operational by December 2022. The paper also highlights our progress with various premises where we're collaborating with fire, and it gives the status of those, and also gives some high-level information about some of the surplus buildings that we have planned to dispose of, which help raise capital receipts that then form part of the funding for the capital programme over the medium-term financial plan, and that's set out in that report as well. So that's just a high-level overview of finance and estates, and I'm just asking if there's any questions on those.
I don't think I do have any questions on those. I've got a couple of questions moving on to page 28, but it's not really money, it's statistics that you've got in a table there.
I might be able to help you with that, Commissioner.
Well, just looking at attending emergencies, second bullet shows 87.1% of rural emergencies were attended within the target time, 20 minutes. And I just wondered whether the 12.9% was beyond our reach because of transit times, or whether that was there was anything we could do to bear down on that.
So the target that we've got ourselves is to attend 90% within the 20 minutes. So it'd be lovely to be able to achieve 100%. Absolutely, that would be a gold standard ambition. So I concur with that. But the target that we've actually got is to attend 90%. So we're currently in that reporting period, as you can see, 2.9% off that target. Now, there's a number of issues here in respect to how we can get to improve the performance there, and there's some capacity issues, undoubtedly, and we already have plans to increase the driver's training school capacity so that we can get more of our frontline officers through the response driving course so that they can respond on blues and twos. And these are things that I think we've shared with you at the last public accountability meeting in terms of where we are with things from my recollection. So that's got a part to play, and when that comes online and we start to see more of our officers being able to respond with blues and twos, that will have a positive impact in terms of moving us towards that 90% target. And of course, that's got to be seen in the context of this significant recruitment that we've got ongoing at the moment under Operation Uplift, and the fact that we've obviously responding to government's requirement to do that with an organisation that was structured in a way that it did have sufficient driving school capacity for what we expected, but with the uplift, of course, it's a real challenge. There are also some technology issues here and some process issues here at play. So we're exploring whether or not we can get an auto transfer function of our grade A calls into the control room. That will actually reduce the amount of time it takes internally within the control room to be able to reduce it. That will ultimately improve our ability to deal with that 20-minute target, because every second does in fact count. So that will help in some small way to us achieving the target that we've set ourselves. At the moment, actually dispatch within the control room is done by professional judgment of the controller. But again, we're trying new technology to try and keep ourselves innovative and at the cutting edge in terms of our command and control system called Storm, so that actually the Storm system itself, using the GPS on each of our vehicles out in the communities, will automatically identify the nearest unit and suggest that that is the unit that goes, and therefore dispatch it, and again reducing the time internally to get that call out to the front line so that the officer can start responding appropriately. Again, that will impact positively. And then there are some administrative stuff in terms of just human nature. We do have a number of failures to arrive on scene because the officer at the moment with the technology has to literally click their button to say that they've arrived at scene, and it's the clicking of that button on their radio then stops the clock, and that then creates the kind of performance data against the target. Now, given the nature of some of these grade A jobs that they're going to, adrenaline's running, they have to respond immediately, just the cut and thrust of frontline policing, that's not something that they always remember 100% of time. And I think that's actually understandable, certainly from my days of doing it. But again, we're looking to see if we can get an automated on-scene function using the GPS data that says they've arrived. A combination of those things will hopefully see us meet the target. It's strong performance, but it's not against the target we've set ourselves. But hopefully those things, when they come online, will see us consistently hit our target.
Great, thank you. And going forward to page 31, there's another statistic there that caught my eye. 68% of respondents felt that the police understood the issues affecting their community. That leaves 32%, just under a third, who seem to feel that the police don't understand the issues in their communities. And I wondered whether you had a feel for what the issue was there and how we might address this.
So I think we've probably got the best survey we've had in my memory of the constabulary, in the sense that over the course of the year, I think it's something like 4,500 individuals are in fact surveyed, which is far better than the England and Wales crime survey that the government and HMIC use in terms of public confidence and satisfaction. So in that sense, that's really encouraging that we have the best possible sample survey than we've ever had in terms of understanding what's going on, and that does go down to district level. In terms of trying to address this issue, we have a number of initiatives really. So we obviously have got Park Walk Talk as a way in which we're engaging and encouraging our police officers to make sure that they're more visible within communities and speaking with members of the public and engaging members of the publics, not just obviously responding from job to job to job. So in their downtime, they get structured taskings around hotspots and high footfall locations to go out and actually walk and speak with members of the public to understand what's going on and speak to them with purpose. Purpose is about, what are policing issues for you in your local community such as this. And we hope that that will be one way in which we can change and shift this 68% respondents and make it higher through that particular initiative. Not only that, but our engagement officers will work with the key individual network groups within the individual communities to help develop an understanding of what's going on. And if those individuals are surveyed, then of course, hopefully they would see that as a positive way of the police being able to actually understand and be interested in the issues affecting their local communities. Social media polling, we use our own social media platforms and asking the public what's important to them in their local areas, linked in with the SNAP meetings that we've got, the meetings where we're duty bound to understand what the local priorities are for communities. We do that online too via My Neighbourhood, which is a growing, successful and a bigger part of people's everyday life. And we put surveys on there to understand what local communities and local people feel are their actual priorities, and again that then gets fed into and reflected into local policing priorities as a consequence. Safer schools, recognising the local issues raised by children and young people, directed patrols for beat managers and our whole neighbourhood policing strategy and effort. And more recently, actually, I'd like to obviously commend the work that we're starting to do in terms of using the Home Office pilot in terms of the Street Safe website. And we're actively pushing and encouraging communities within Norfolk to go onto the Street Safe website and actually tell us through that website, their concerns, what are the issues, where are the places within the county of Norfolk where they feel vulnerable or concerned or fearful for whatever reason. And it's a fantastic website in terms of being able to drill down into the granularity of what the concern is about that location. And I've set up with our colleagues within the organisation a way in which we can access that on an hour by hour basis, see what the communities and the public are telling us, see what our issues are directly related to policing, see what issues are directly related to our work in partnerships in terms of street lighting and littering issues, etc., and then task out our local officers in terms of those areas identified by that Street Safe website to be able to then respond. So almost you said, and this is what we did. So I think we've got a range of issues and a range of activity and energy across our local policing offer within our local neighbourhood policing strategy that I oversee, that is designed to address this issue, to be able to, prove to the public that actually we are listening and that we've got a pretty good understanding about what's going on within your locality and we're responding to it. And the fact that actually 68% of people who are surveyed feel that is really encouraging and positive. That's really high actually when it comes to public surveys across the range of things. But of course, surveys are obviously limited. And if nobody that's surveyed out of those 4,500 people across 12 months across Norfolk get to see the effort and energy of Park Walk Talk, get to be a member of the Key Individual Network, get to see the social media polling, get to be at a SNAP meeting, speak with their local community officers, then of course it becomes very challenging, doesn't it? But I'm really encouraged as a consequence that actually 68% do in fact feel that we understand and are addressing the issues that they are affected by locally.
No, that's reassuring from my perspective, because having picked out what appeared to be a low statistic in comparison with others, it's really good to know that you're on the case and dealing with it. Thank you for that. That's all I've got on item 6, unless anyone else wants to chip in. See no hands going up. Let's move on to item 7, which is a report on increased visible policing. Report beginning at page 32.
Commissioner,
I assume Simon would have led on this. Are you going to lead on this?
No, I'll be asking Nick to lead on this, Commissioner.
Okay.
So, Commissioner, obviously, we've all had sight of the paper and it's a public paper, but, the summary is obviously we have always worked really hard to ensure that local, visible and engaging police style is at the heart of what we do. We have a neighbourhood policing strategy that is designed to deliver that. That is in line with the National Police Chief Council's and the whole of the police services ethos about local, visible and engaged policing style, neighbourhood policing being at the heart of what we seek to do. And I know that that's something that's very important to you, particularly in terms of visibility and engagement. And we're working hard to be able to deliver that on your behalf as you represent the communities. So I think that's a statement I would make. I mean, the paper sets out where we are with the current neighbourhood policing model. It does talk briefly about the impact that COVID has had on the delivery of policing, visible policing, because it undoubtedly has, and we're still, working through that. It does talk about the post-COVID review work on engagement and what we're trying to do to engage and be visible in a COVID world. Let alone a post-COVID world, and it talks about some of the next steps really. So, I mean, that's a kind of a summary of what the paper is about, and it's just to what level would you like me to go into in terms of some of the detail of the paper, or is that sufficient? And maybe you just have some questions. I'll be guided by yourself.
I think if we go on to questions, because different people would want different things, and the paper will be available if people want to read it. One question from me on the question of engagement officers. I'm aware that one engagement officer is a member of police staff rather than being a uniformed officer. And certainly my impression is that arrangement is working, not least because of the quality of the individual and the work she's putting into it. But I just wondered whether the civilianisation of engagement officers was a more general direction of travel, and whether it defeated the idea of engagement officers from a public perception perspective.
So, Commissioner, we have a number of police officer individuals who we get to perform the engagement officer role, and that currently stands at, I believe, about 7 individuals who sit within the district boundaries. There might be some slight adjustments on that numbers because of the introduction of that police staff member, but broadly, each of our policing districts has an identified engagement officer who has a number of roles, one of which is engaging with the communities, managing the SNAP meetings, being able to kind of deal with parish councils, send out newsletters, be a point of contact to local key individual networks as well as deal with a few other things too. So that's the structure that we've got. Where we are at the moment is we've made a commitment to identify and recruit some police staff digital engagement officers, which will at the moment seek to complement the work of those police officer engagement members of staff that I've just spoken about. We are in the process of recruiting those digital engagement officers. We've got one in post already, and that individual is helping us shape the new role. Those digital engagement officers will principally work alongside our central communications team, and they will start to professionalise our use of our digital platforms and the digital space and the digital way in which we communicate with the public, so that we can move from where we currently are, which is transmitting information out to the communities about what's going on in policing and seeking their views, to one where we are not only transmitting but also interacting and receiving and responding much more positively than we're able to at the moment, as the public actually want us to do, because they want to move more online to digital engagement with us. They expect us to be able to keep up with them in terms of public service, and we need to make that investment. And those individuals are coming online, and we hope that we'll have those recruited very, very early in 2022. I think at that point, the Constabulary will take stock of where we are with those digital engagement officers, the extra investment that we've made within our central community safety team, where we have a central core safer neighbourhood team that is able to go to any community across the county of Norfolk. And we've made that further investment in terms of engagement and neighbourhood policing, and take stock with the impact and effectiveness of that team, the digital engagement officers as they come online, and where and what that means for the traditional engagement officers that I've described at the very beginning. And it may be that we seek to either reduce, integrate, or sustain those engagement officers as well, to make sure that we've got not only police officers, but the digital police staff members and then that core team. So at the moment, I'm in the process of kind of really trying to understand and evaluate what's the most efficient and effective use of limited resources to be able to deliver engagement and respond to the public. And I think that's probably where I am at the moment.
Great, thank you. I've got three further questions that came in from the public. The first is a request that you increase the number of police on the beat. And the questioner asked that officers patrol on foot and not by car, that there be a 24/7 presence, and that officers work in pairs. I sense I know the answer to this one is going to be based on priorities and resources.
So certainly from my perspective, Commissioner, look, we have a neighbourhood policing offer. We have a strategy and we have dedicated neighbourhood policing officers. The beat managers, there's slightly over 100 of them dedicated to all of the local communities here in Norfolk. They are designed in terms of their role profile and their function to deal with local community issues, and they do just that. They set up pop-up engagement opportunities. They develop relationships with key organisations and individuals and locations within communities, and they are there, and a combination of foot patrol, cycle patrol, as well as vehicle patrol. So we have that existing offer. We constantly obviously review our ability to increase that offer and to see what we can do with the resources that we've got. And you know, my promise to you in terms of delivering and leading on local policing is that is something that we do all the time, particularly myself and the CPC commander. In terms of you know, being out and about of cars, obviously we need to respond to jobs and we need to get from A to B, and this is a rural county, so there has to be a balance there, and certainly the patrol officers do not have the opportunity to do that as much as perhaps we would like them to do. That said, we do have, as I've mentioned already, the park, walk, talk approach, which is applicable to beat managers and to patrol officers. So in patrol officers' downtime, there is a direction for them, and they are doing it. And I know that they're doing it because I have a piece of technology that shows me the number of engagements right across the county, which I can share with you, which sees patrol officers getting out of their car and walking and making contact and engaging and speaking with members of the public. So yes, it is a challenge, but we have structure, we have an approach, and we have a determination to be as accessible and visible as we possibly can. But it's got to be seen in the context of, we've got to provide a policing service and respond to the calls to service and across a rural county. That does necessitate vehicle use.
Thank you. I can certainly report back that I'm hearing a lot of very good stuff from the public about Park Walk and Talk. They are noticing the difference and they're appreciative of the difference. So you are making inroads there.
But Commissioner, just to give you confidence in terms of holding us to account, you know, I'm more than happy to share with you that engagement app and show you the granularity of the information that we've got about just how much our police officers are actually out and about on foot and in high footfall locations, speaking and directly engaging with members of the public. I hope that you'll be impressed, and I'm happy to share that data with you.
No, I'd welcome that. I think it'd be very good for my education, and more importantly, it would give me more substance when I'm talking to members of the public on this point. The next question then is a request to make it easier for the public to be able to contact the police. The questioner particularly cites telephone as the example, so I imagine he's referring to non-emergency 101 and direct dial contacts. And there's also a comment that it's a question that's why is it so difficult to get through on 101? This is a perennial, I know, but I think it's worth tackling once again.
So, Commissioner, there are a number of forms by which the public can engage with the police. We've got the traditional telephony approaches of 999 and 101, and I think that's well understood by the public. But the public can also call into the Constabulary control room via email as well. And we've also got Athena PE, which allows the public to do a number of transactions actually via the web online, including reporting certain crime types as well as dealing with certain administrative functions as well. So there is a number of ways in which the public can actually make contact. Perhaps if I could just focus in on the 101 issue, it has been recognised by the Constabulary in terms of the public's kind of demand, if you will, and belief about how easy it should be to get through the 101. The Constabulary has responded to that. We have put in place a call triage system, which allows us to rank calls in terms of priority around threat, risk and harm. We have been able to introduce a measure which supports the public on the 101 system, whereby if they are waiting, we prompt them within the call to be able to understand that there are different ways in which they might be able to deal with that issue, and encourage them to shift that that approach in that regard, because they are more likely, actually, particularly in some of the administrative calls that come into us, to get a faster response if they emailed it in. And we prompt that through that 101 call handling approach. Not only that, actually, there will be at least one occasion, because of the investments we've been able to make with the control room switchboard, whereby a member of the control room will actually speak to the individual in that 101 call to understand what it is that they're there to do, make sure that they've actually done it right in terms of 101 and threat, risk and harm, and if they had to divert it to a 999, they absolutely can, but also to advise the member of the public about that there might be a different way to be able to take that call forward. So we are doing a lot of work in this area. And actually, in terms of those calls, we do find ourselves in a stronger position than we were perhaps 13 months ago. So it was true that the time taken to answer was quite poor. We've still got a journey to go, but in the last 13 months, actually, we've improved from answering approximately 50% of calls within 30 seconds to now answering approximately 80% of calls within 30 seconds. I mean, I would challenge any call centre in the UK, public or private, to be able to deliver that on a non-999 basis. That is very, very strong performance in my humble opinion. More than that, actually, within that same 13 month period, the number of calls that have been abandoned, i.e. the member of the public has got through but then has just stopped calling us for whatever reason, the abandonment rate has gone down from 12% to approximately 3 to 4% only over that same period. And the investments that we've made within the control room, within switchboard, within the call handlers, within the actual way in which the 101 system works, are slowly but surely making significant improvements in that service.
No, thank you for that. I sense we still have a way to go to change public perception on that, but you know, I'm grateful for the explanation for all the work that's been done, because I'm conscious that a lot of work has been done. So it's good to get that out into the public domain. The last question from the public is a request for police in schools to show a friendly face to students and to listen to their issues. Now, I sense that that might have been a casualty to COVID, and it's a case of re-establishing that presence. And my understanding is that that work is in hand, but perhaps you could sort of give us an update on that.
So again, Commissioner, I mean, we have a Safer Schools offer within community safety, and we actually have police officers embedded in, I think it's 14 of our high schools across the county, and we have that centred around our community safety team. We have an inspector that leads on that. We have a sergeant that supports that work, and some police staff members as well as those 14 police constables in those high schools. And yes, COVID has seen some restrictions around that, but they are back in the schools. They support the schools with a whole range of issues, and teachers as well. They deliver programs of work in terms of, you know, healthy relationship inputs, knife crime inputs around drugs and alcohol and county lines, issues around online and cyber security and safety, healthy relationships, that whole issue around, you know, in terms of how actually we have to get really upstream about the whole issue about misogyny, sexual harassment in our society by actually ensuring that we invest in dealing with these issues in junior school as well as high school. And that to me actually is not a core police function, but we're there doing it in the absence of others. So you know, the questioner asked, can we have officers in school? We've got officers in school.
Very clear, thank you. I think that's all I've got on item 7, unless any hands go up, and I don't see any hands rushing up at the moment. Let's move on to item 8, which is prevent offending. Who do we want to lead on this?
Thanks, Commissioner. I believe that's with me this afternoon. Obviously, a paper that's been provided, and again, just mindful of time, so I'll keep some high-level comments and then deal with any questions if that's okay with you. So the paper provides an overview of the current use of out-of-court disposals for low-level offences within the county. It also talks about the strategic direction and the requirements for us to be fit for purpose moving forward, and then finally outlines our modernisation plan for Norfolk around the issuing of out-of-court disposals. In short, we currently have a range of different options available in Norfolk. There is a need to streamline that to a 2-tier only system that will see us remove a number of out-of-court disposal options and then focus solely on conditional cautioning and community resolution. That's come about as development over a number of years, some pilot work that's been done in other forces, and some review work around traditional simple cautions that has led to an evidence base that suggests this is a stronger approach to ensure greater victim satisfaction, better timescales within the criminal justice system, and also expected reductions in repeat offending. We were working towards this as a result of the NPCC strategy to do so by 2025 at our own pace, but then also importantly, next year, the police crime sentencing and courts bill will mandate that two-tier approach for all police forces anyway. The Norfolk approach as it stands, we were quite well advanced a couple of years ago, but have been heavily delayed in our progress due to the pandemic because of the nature of the work that's needed to do quite a bit of face-to-face work with victims and offenders to make this a success. So things were delayed. However, we have an appointed lead, which is the Chief Superintendent for Joint Justice Services across Norfolk and Suffolk, Julie Venth, and we've got a development plan that, or a developed project plan that's reported to chief officers regularly. Phase 1 implementation for us went live in September of this year in Great Yarmouth only. That approach will be subject to evaluation at the 6-month point, ongoing reviews as well. We've already delivered awareness training to practitioners in that area, and the approach has 2 really key elements of support. One is offender diversion team, which is a dedicated group of staff that are there to advise practitioners to make sure we get that consistency and standardisation to our out-of-court disposals. It allows us to do referrals for those interventions. We mentioned one earlier today, Project Nova. This is the type of work that this team will be focusing on to make sure people get the right referrals as offenders. That team will also undertake the partnership liaison and make decisions around non-compliance with those conditional cautions in particular, which would then lead to a move into criminal justice more formally, and therefore they'll provide case file support as well. The second element is the interventions hub, which is a digital resource for offenders to be directed to. We've subcontracted that jointly with Suffolk to Red Snapper, who have got proven experience in this area, having been successful in providing similar services elsewhere. This approach will provide us a different level of management information than we currently have, so we'll have a much greater insight around victim views through survey work, and we'll have a much greater insight around breaches of cautions as opposed to simple cautions that don't have that element. We'll be able to monitor reoffending patterns, seek offender views around it, and interestingly and importantly, invite some independent scrutiny through scrutiny panels that we will have in place to look at the use of those disposals. Phase 2 will be a rollout to the rest of the county, which we would anticipate having completed by April 2023. The 2-phase approach gives us the chance in the middle point to review that evaluation, make adjustments to get this absolutely right and fit for purpose for Norfolk. We will continue the evaluation work even after we do the full rollout, and there'll be regular reporting that I think you're probably already aware of through the local criminal justice board as well as internally. So that's a brief overview of the paper, but happy to deal with any questions.
Thanks, Amy. 2, if I may, on statistics in the paper. Page 48, I note that the report states that the number of online crimes has risen by 62.3% in the last 12 months. I just wondered if you could comment on that increase and what we might be doing about it.
Yes, so obviously this is a growing area of crime trend more generally, so it's one that is not always suitable for traditional criminal justice routes, just by way of volumes. Obviously we know that we are in a very delicate position with courts as a result of the pandemic, some backlogs particularly with the Crown courts. So the opportunity of using out-of-court disposals, but then making sure that they're fit for purpose and having those conditions that can then be imposed on the offenders. This gives us a different area, a different approach to those cyber-enabled crimes that are only going to go in one direction, only going to increase as we become more sophisticated in our detection of them.
Commissioner, can I perhaps add a little bit more to that in terms of supporting AIM and
Please,
I
yeah.
think from your perspective, it's a kind of about, you know, what's the constabulary doing to reduce the chance of somebody in Norfolk becoming a victim of those online crimes in terms of the issues. And of course, I'd just kind of add to what Eamon has already talked to you about in terms of the work that we do in partnership through the County Community Safety Partnership and your office around Norfolk Against Scams Partnership. You know, and our kind of public awareness raising about these issues. The best way to be able to do this is for prevention and self-prevention, and for all of us as members of the public to become invested in keeping ourselves safe online. So the Scam Partnership provides information and advice, as does the Adult Safeguarding Board, to help us all as individuals understand how these online kind of crime and criminalities take place, and how we can protect ourselves from keeping our virus software up to date, making sure that we don't kind of get hung up with the emails that come through asking for money or getting us to click on the hyperlinks, and what we should do in terms of then sending those emails on to Action Fraud and other agencies that are dealing with it. So there's a whole load of prevention work that goes on in terms of partnership working under the Norfolk Against Scams Partnership banner. And I think I'd refer you back to my earlier answer about the fraud question and the work that we've got with the cyber fraud team, the cyber fraud prevention officers who go out and work with businesses, and a whole load of material that is available to the public to deal with this and start to reduce individuals' vulnerability to that.
Yeah, a significant overlap there. I see that. Thank you for that. Just looking at page 50, recorded hate crime is going up across the county, but I noted North Norfolk as the particular example, up 83.6%. Could you just elaborate on what's causing the increase, and what can we do to counter that?
I mean, shall I know that's in your paper, but that's a Norfolk issue, and you obviously support us across the joint space. I'll take that question if that works for you, Eamon. Okay. So Commissioner, it's a really complicated issue, because actually we know that hate crime is underreported, and there's a bit of me that says I welcome an increase on one point, because we know it's underrecorded. So if we're seeing a public more in tune and feeling more capable and confident to report it, then that's got to be a good thing, so that we can understand the true nature of it and the true extent of it, and then use that evidence-based analysis to build in, you know, interventions to be able to try and deal with that. So on one hand, it's encouraging to see an increase. On the other hand, of course, it's hugely disappointing and to all of us that actually people are having to endure and suffer hate crime. So I see it in that context. In terms of why, so there hasn't been a change in the definition, so that's not a driver. One thing I would observe over the last nearly 2 years now with the COVID pandemic is we really have seen a correlation between some of the issues that we've got ongoing globally around hate crime issue, whether it's Black Lives Matter or some of the issues that we've seen that going on in Israel, and then what that means in terms of anti-Semitism globally. That I have analysis which shows you a direct correlation between these global, international, national events and actually an increase in hate crime in Norfolk in terms of the reporting of it and hate incidents in Norfolk. So it's truly a global issue. And that becomes really difficult to tackle in that rate. But that is actually one of the drivers that's been behind it. So what do we do to tackle this? Well, we've got the Stop Hate in Norfolk, which is a third-party reporting mechanism, which again is trying to design and encourage people to report it in terms of confidence. There are criminal offences in respect to hate crime. And we take those on and we investigate them, and we support our officers in terms of understanding what the issues are and how to investigate them as best they can with the evidence that is available. We support our officers in terms of understanding of what hate crime is, so that they can respond appropriately, professionally, and with an understanding about the impact that it has on the victim. and we work with partners within the community, such as key individual networks working with communities that suffer hate, whether it's through gender, through sexuality, through ethnicity, to encourage them to get people to come forward to us and report what's happened to them, so that we can deal with it in the normal way that we would with any other criminal justice investigation. So there's a range of things that we do to, one, promote people coming forward and telling us their experience, work with partners to support people to have the confidence to come forward, give us statements, give us evidence and information so that we can take forward investigations where we possibly can and bring the perpetrators to justice. But it is a global scheme, a global issue that has a very local feeling as well, but impacted upon globally. So the question was, about why such a rise, and my answer is what we've seen in the last 2 years, particularly around the global impact and how it then relates here in Norfolk as well. It does in Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, and other counties, because they see the same.
Thank you.
And Commissioner, would you mind if I just added? I mean, absolutely endorse everything that Nick has said. Specific to North Norfolk, there has been a particular issue in sea pooling that relates to the transsexual community, a particular community issue there, and that is a significant driver driver for the statistics that you see in the North Norfolk district.
That's very helpful to know. Yeah, so that puts that into a particular context. Good. Anything else on item 8? I shall assume that no hands will go up and move on to item 9, emergency services collaboration.
Commissioner, there's a long paper that has been circulated with the minutes, which provides an overview of the extent of the collaboration between Norfolk and Suffolk Constabularies. With your consent, I think it'd be most appropriate just to note the paper. And I would just ask you if you have any questions, but the paper in most respects just speaks for itself.
I don't have any questions. We do have a collaboration meeting coming up. I can't remember if it's the end of this week or middle of next week, I think it is. But I think that the collaboration with Suffolk seems to be in a good place. So that's encouraging. So thank you for that. So we can move on swiftly then to item 10, emerging operational and organisational risks.
Well, in many respects, I think we've covered these during the meeting. The significant challenges facing the service at the moment relate to violence against women and girls, domestic abuse and rape. So we've discussed them at length today, and also the challenges of addressing the growing number of priorities within the limitations of our resource. In addition to that, we do have some concerns with regards to street violence committed by a small group of individuals, primarily in the Norwich area, but also within Yarmouth. And we are carrying out a number of operations. I'll go into no more detail, but a number of operations to try and address that offending. But that is also a particular challenge for us. And I think it's fair to say that we're now seeing the nighttime economy getting into full swing, and that is also causing challenges which aren't new to us, but challenges that we haven't had during the period of restrictions within the pandemic. But I have no other exceptional points to raise in this forum.
No, thank you. And I'm mindful that you and I talk regularly about issues as they occur. So from the public's perspective, they should be aware that there is a constant dialogue, and it's not just a dialogue in this forum.
Absolutely.
Good. Sprinting to the finish. Item 11, any other business? Any hands going up? Item 12, date of the next meeting. which is Wednesday, the 26th of January, starting at 10:30. And as I said at the beginning, we will consider whether we can have probably a hybrid meeting. So, meeting with some in person, but others attending electronically. However, we will need to make that judgment based on the state of COVID and other things at the time. I sense with the way the news is going and with what was said on the COVID report that we're probably looking more at another virtual meeting. So, yeah, that was a really lengthy session and we uncovered some important ground. Started with a focus on trust. We moved on to the wider work of the constabulary. I really hope that both parts reassured the public. And Paul, I'm hugely grateful to you and your team for all the work that's gone in today. Grateful to my own team for the work they put into this. And I'm actually very grateful to the public for engaging in this process and for providing most of the questions, because I think their involvement makes this as a worthwhile forum. So thank you to everyone, and until next time.
Thank you.
Take care.